frame building, his first skyscraper. And remember, the word skyscraper originally, as it was used in Chicago first, really didn't have much to do with height. They called it skyscraper construction. And that was the construction we talked about, where the frame carries its own fireproofing, which William LeBaron Jenney apparently worked out for the first time at the Home Insurance Building in 1884. And here's Sullivan, does his first one in 1890. And it's not in Chicago, of course, but it's in St. Louis. But the thing is, it's in the same urban situation. And the fact that these skyscrapers are not that much taller, really, than the older buildings, they're taller, all right, but they're basically in the same scale, means that it's still in the same kind of urbanism. It's still in traditional Renaissance urbanism. And it's designed, Sullivan designs it, you see it right here, he designs it as a block. And what we're looking at is St. Louis in the horrible throes of redevelopment. Here, there were buildings like these. And then this was all torn down, and these horrible parking garages were built to serve a big stadium, which remember is right over here. That's all redevelopment. And then Sarin's Arch, we might almost be on it. The St. Louis Memorial Arch right here. And this is a great 19th century courthouse, two existing buildings, and they were scheduled when we came there in 1984 for a jury to see what to do about this building. These were slated for demolition, as was this one right there. And the very first thing we all said to the town and the state, because they were both involved, was don't touch those buildings, don't tear them down, leave them there. Sullivan's building is meant to be seen in relation to buildings like that. It's meant to be seen, imagine it must be full of, you wouldn't see it this way. You'd have big buildings like these here, you come through there, and there it is, and you see it as a block. You see it as a chunk, and it fits right into the street. And it needs the pre-existing buildings because while it looks like a solid block, wonderful palazzo block from here, it really is only a few bays deep on both sides. So if you tear those down, all of a sudden the whole character of the building is lost. So, but they didn't pay any attention to us, and they tore both those down. Now, we saw that it was a basically traditional urban situation, the kind that Palladio handled so well in Vicenza. And the Palazzo Valmarana in Vicenza is like a model for Sullivan. Look, he's next to a building like this one, as Palladio was, on a narrow street like this. He wants his building to be a little bigger, but he wants it most of all to stand out, so he does what the other building hadn't done. He has colossal pilasters that go the whole way and give his building a kind of unity and a kind of presence the other building doesn't have, but still gets along with it, doesn't hurt the street, doesn't hurt this building. It's that principle of the building being the same as all others, but decorated differently, which is what's so good about the Italian palazzo, which is what this model is. Then, unfortunately, as I say, I forget the lights. They didn't listen to us, and they tore down the buildings. And the building that won the competition, as I told you last time, really, we were wrong. It shouldn't have won. You see what it does. All this is completely undesigned. The building has lost all its volume. It's lost all its presence. It was never intended to stand free. Now, that business of tearing it down is something that they inherited from what had been happening in modern architecture, as you know, at that time. And the worst example is what happened on Park Avenue, where you had Park Avenue as it existed with solid street walls, which defined it. And here we are, what you might call it, the military crest. And from there you got a shot all the way down. And indeed, Oldenburg did a great project where he's going to have enormous balls here, bowling balls, rolling down here. And you really feel that would be wonderful there. And then you had the tower here of the Grand Central System, the office building, and this is narrow, so the space continues. It seems to continue all the way down the avenue. Then you know what happened later. We'll talk about it. Pan Am blocks that. But even before that, over here on the right, Lever Brothers, designed by Gordon Bunshaft, came along and said, look at me, I'm more important than the street. He takes it, instead of defining the street with it, The pre-existing building was about this height. It wasn't very tall, but still it was facing the street and holding it. He turns away from the street, puts a hole in the street, destroys the street to stand out, especially himself. My building. And that is an example of not thinking in urbanistic terms, but in terms of small-scale Bauhaus design. After all, they were trained to design in Bundschaft, most of all trained to design with little paper models. They folded paper. They worked at this scale. So things that look fine like that, like the Pan Am building, for example, as we'll talk about later, destroy the urban situation if the urban situation isn't valued. And they didn't value it at all. Bundschaft didn't. They despised the Racket Club and the rest of Park Avenue. But Sullivan, though he's determined to be different all this time, he's talking about originality all the time, never occurs to him to destroy the urban, pre-existing urban fabric. Never comes to him at all. He's still working like Michelangelo with the basics of traditional urbanism, and he's trying to make his building stand out, but at the same time get along with the rest of the building. So he does this great block. Now, he does that, of course, with Adler. Dankmar Adler is his partner, and Adler does all the tough work in the office. I mean, he handles everything. He handles all the business. Then designing the auditorium, he does the acoustics. Sullivan really basically just does the facades at this time. And this is the last building he did with Adler, the last one in that partnership. And it's the Guarantee Building in Buffalo, again, not in Chicago. Now, this is of 1895, and we might take it as the real climax of Sullivan's tall buildings, because you can see it looks a lot taller, looks a lot more energetically lifting vertically than does the Wainwright Building. The Wainwright Building is solid below here, and here it all opens up. So you can see that there are columns here, only every other pilaster. Then you realize that over here, he doesn't show you that, but it's the same thing. So this feels like a solid base and a pretty solid interwoven web and a heavy pediment. All this stands free, stretches, lifts up, turns up at the top, pulls back down again. The whole thing has a lot of energy in it, which he's somehow able to imbue it with. Now, it looks as if it's designed as a freestanding tower, but it wasn't. As a matter of fact, these are the only two facades that Sullivan designed. The rest of it's just brick back there. What Frank Lloyd Wright used to call Queen Anne front and Mary Ann behind, and that's basically what you had, because this is what happened around it. This is what Sullivan expected. He expected to have other buildings go up around it, so that's all that you see. Nevertheless, it does have that great energy. And it's interesting, it's as if he picked up the arch situation of the first of these types, the Marshall Field Warehouse. But then he gets rid of the masonry. It's light terracotta instead of masonry fireproofing. And then he picks it all the way up and brings it all the way down. And you feel these standing on legs here. And the whole thing is exactly what Sullivan said it was. And when he wrote his Kindergarten Chats, he talked about the Marshall Field Warehouse, and he said, here is a man for you to look at. This is typical 19th century gender-centered criticism, but nevertheless it's empathy. Here is a man for you to look at who stands on two legs, stretches and stirs. In a world of barren pettiness, a male is again gender sure, but the point is he feels it as a body which lifts, and his body is even more so. You look at that, you feel it stretch and lift and stir. Now a lot of that is because of the thinness of that terracotta covering and the arches up above and the kind of decoration that runs across it that looks very metallic and makes you feel the thinness of the steel, which you didn't at the Wainwright Building. The steel was inside. Now, I think he gets that from a very strange source, and I think it can be documented. I think it's from the Irish manuscripts that are done in Ireland and in northern England in the 7th and 8th centuries. It's before the rest of Europe had begun under Charlemagne to revive Rome. It was carrying on Christianity at the very edges of Christendom. And it was doing it with a wonderful art which derived a lot from barbarian metalwork and from the old Celtic background of the North Britannic and the Irish tribes. Now, the most famous monument is the Book of Kells, which is in the Trinity College Library in Dublin. There are also the Lindisfarne Gospels and many others. They're made all the way from the eastern coast of England all the way across Ireland. Now this is a page, a canon page in the Book of Kells. You see what you've got. You've got pilaster-like flat columns which are covered with a design that looks metallic. Then they arch over, then they have the others inside, so there's this arch motif with thin, stretched, metallic-like ornament. Now, the reason it looks like metal is that the manuscripts show the dominance of a technique of metalwork. It comes from Celtic and barbarian metalwork. And these figures are all little barbarian animal-style figures all biting each other, all alive. Imagine that. Imagine you're in this cell. Out there is the sea. These monasteries are little places with the sea outside. You're in this cell. You're looking into the book. And remember, the book is an invention of Christianity, of the early Middle Ages. In antiquity, they had scrolls like this. So you're outside the book. You get in like this. So you can be inside a book. You can lose yourself in a book the way you can't quite in the same way in the classic scroll, which is always outside you like that. And so you're in that book, and you're just with that pen, and they're moving, and you see how metallic it looks. Originally, it's being based on models of Celtic metalwork going all the way back to 1000 BC. So the same is true of Sullivan's. His terracotta, using that kind of ornament, looks like metal. So all of a sudden you feel it's a metal building, which you didn't in the Wainwright building or in any of the others. Now it's really metal. Still, it's fireproofed. It's covered. You see how it's like the Book of Kells, how it's energetic, and it's moving all the time. And he's obsessed with it. It's wonderful. And these people will do it. These people will make it in the shops. It's a complicated terracotta process going on there. They do it with great joy. They love to do it. Look again how metallic it looks. See it's stretched. It's really wonderful. It doesn't seem very important. You're still in the palazzo model. You're not like Gary or somebody rolling all over the landscape. But wonderful, tense, just that thing is changing it intensely. You see, look at the difference. This is beautiful, but there you feel the flat masonry, the brick, the redness, the static quality, that's on that, and it's capped up above. This is just taut. Your eye just can't go to that except running up and down. Look, it makes your eye run up and down it. It really does. And it looks like steel. It looks like metal. And even so, if you get down, for example, where he exploits that most, where he strips away the masonry and shows you where the columns actually are, the really supporting columns. So you get that stretched quality down below. And look at the details there that he has on the surface, where he has these little squares, which he turns like this and pulls to the point here where there's some compression right in there. He pulls it like that to stretch it. That comes right from the Lindisfarne Gospels. You see them here. You feel it like this. Again, stretched the same way, using these to carry the eye, so the eye is always moving across it. And he gets these little animals up there, and they're all interwoven, and they make his capitals. Right here, at that point of compression, he shows you above as if these two elements are coming together, and they're being riveted together up there, and then this supports them, and the weight comes down here, and it crushes down. You feel it all through here. He's having such a wonderful time with it. He must have sat there, drawn and drawn. You can imagine Wright watching him do it too. Wright, whose architecture is nowhere like this, but who said he learned it all from Sullivan's Ornament. And I think he really is telling the truth there. He's watching him caring and moving all those planes one inside the other, like this. It's just one not going home, just staying there and doing it, which is really what they did do. And then when he gets to the doorway, of course, unlike the Wainwright, he wants to indicate that it's a little different there from the other bays, and he calls to the arches up above. But if you look at that, you see all this? And that's right from one of the great pages of the saints. This is the St. Mark's page from the Lindisfarne Gospels. It's almost the same partie. You have a rectangle with an arch in it, and then the human figure is as metallic. It obeys the ornamental laws. not the classic laws of the figure standing in space, but the ornamental laws of that surface moving like that. And it all feels metallic. It's very much like it. Now, the interesting thing is that what happened to that Celtic civilization and to those manuscripts in the 9th century is basically that Charlemagne, the king of the Franks, became crowned Holy Roman Emperor in Rome in 800. As soon as he does, he's really ruling by this time all of Western Europe, down into Spain, where the Muslims are, and up way on through Saxony and so on. It was too bad it didn't stay that way, all one country under him. He institutes a classic revival, very consciously, in order to bolster the idea of the emperor and of the return of the empire and of order, finally. And you can see what happens. Here's a so-called Carolingian manuscript of the 9th century, the Ada school. And look what you got. All of a sudden, that figure becomes the classical figure once again. And that ornamental, flat metal architecture becomes the illusion of depth, the body sitting in it, classical columns, classical sense of a dome, and classic masonry back there. And all of a sudden, clearly, that's the classic world. Now, since that time, as you know, there have been hundreds of classical revivals. We're in the middle of one now, or somewhere in one right at this moment. The memory of classical architecture we've never been able to get it out of the consciousness, no reason we should, of Western man. But that happened also in the 1890s. That's exactly what happened. If you look at the doorway of the University Club on Fifth Avenue in New York by McKinley & White of 1900, and then contrast it with Sullivan's doorway here of 1895, you see exactly the same thing has happened. You've had a classic revival, you have classical columns, you have a wonderful sort of French 16th century rusticated patterns behind it maybe, and wonderful playing with those metapies up there. That's really great. Pushing it over there into the corner. But there is the classic world comes back. And that, of course, is the kind of thing that later, largely because of Sullivan himself, who saw these people taking his work, build it up into a great big drama of the destruction of democracy by what he called feudalism, kind of thing that Wright continued later, and then rather thoughtless, I think, critics trying to support modernism, especially Gideon in space-time and architecture, they see all this architecture as really villainous, and they still do, people of this type. And it's hard to understand. I mean, but nevertheless, it's part of the beginning of those great totalitarian patterns of thought of the 20th century, where everybody thinks what I say is right, the other must be wrong. And classicism, say like the University Club, which we see here in New York in 1900, is seen as a really kind of evil thing. I remember very young, when I was young and marinated in modernism, one could hardly look at these. One was pre-programmed to see this as something really that destroyed originality, that destroyed. And Ayn Rand was a mad woman, if there ever was one, in her books. I mean, with like The Fountainhead and so on, have that same quality. That she has her architect blow up a housing project because they changed his design. There is madness for you. There really is. But nevertheless, and yet if you put the two together, you see the buildings, they're not so different. They're just in different places, and they're both very good in their places. I don't think you'd want to see that red brick Wainwright building on Fifth Avenue. It really would look like a country cousin. It would really look as if it came lumbering in from the Middle West. Whereas you wouldn't want to see this. Well, it would be all right, but it wouldn't have that power down there in those dark, crowded streets of St. Louis that the Wainwright building has. Each one is wonderful. It's about the same. They're about the same height. They have not far different the same number of floors, so these are higher, most of them. And I think they work very well at the same time. This is not a steel frame building, by the way. That is a bearing wall. On the other hand, he shows you it's steel frame with the web of structure, but he doesn't insist on it. It wouldn't have to be. After all, there are 19th century buildings that are as pretty much as open as that and all in masonry. Now, McKinley & White, who I'll talk about later, especially in terms of domestic architecture, they do some pretty good skyscrapers, and pretty early. This is in Kansas City, and it's the New York Life Insurance Company by McKinley and White of 1888-89. And you can see it follows the model of the Marshall Field Warehouse, basically, but it insists more on Renaissance details, especially in the cornice, and various details right through here. So it has a flatter, thinner, more drawn quality than Richardson's warmer and stronger and wilder works, but nevertheless, it's a pretty good building. But it isn't doing what Sullivan is doing. What Sullivan is getting primarily from those manuscripts. And you can feel how he must have looked up from his work and saw what was having a great success and thought, I am really doing something new. And what he's really doing is try to make you feel empathetically compression and tension, trying to make you feel the building in your body with the quality of the way buildings work. And again, it comes from the manuscripts. Now, this is the only building he got to do in New York. It's the Bayard building way downtown. And that's all he did. That's just that facade. That's Sullivan. And look what he does. He shows you where the columns are now, clearly. You can't mistake it. And there the column, and there. Then in between, instead of having the mullions, as in all the other buildings, doing the same vertical thing as the others, he has these thick and those thin and rounded, so they look almost like wires, which are being pulled down. And it's as if it goes up to the top, and these compressed elements support it, then it stretches out and comes down, and it isn't supported right there. It's the thing that hangs at this point, hangs right there. And he makes you feel as if almost that string is going to break. You're taught how taut it is, and it's not supported. It's coming down below, it's supporting, and finally the climax at the ground. See, he's turning it around, making you feel it come down on you, like this. These hold, and this comes and barely stops there. He says, I better take care, and he sticks that in like a piece of wood to brace it. You see, it's really amazing. And all the tension, so it's compression and tension. He's working in both. And he must be working very hard on this as he does it. Or again, I already showed you the Gage building of 1898-99, same time, basically, on Michigan Boulevard in Chicago, where these are by Halliburton Roach. They're all by Halliburton Roach, but they let Sullivan design this facade. He's no longer working with Adler. And look what he does. He hates this pragmatically arrived at Chicago window affair. Doesn't like it. You can see why not. Here, the weight of these, unsupported here, visually. If you feel that as compression, there's something really wrong. You can hardly look at that building that way. So he won't let you do that. He makes your eye goes there, to those, to the big clasp, and then he hangs these like that. So it doesn't matter there's nothing here. And but he beefs that up anyway, so you really feel there's something pulling down there. And then in here, to make you feel that even more, he completely confuses that proportion of the bay. And he has a thicker spandrel here with terracotta. Then he has dusky glass here. Then the mullions are small like this, and he has a horizontal window instead of this Chicago. And so the whole thing is like a Venetian blind, rattling down. Held up there and rattles down. He turns it right around, it seems to me. Now that is in a wonderful spot, too, for that. On Michigan Boulevard, it's about, let's see now, this must be Congress Street, about here. It's out of focus, Renee. You're watching. That's better. This must be Congress Street about here. So this is along about in here. But if you just go in past the loop, which is right there, that's where the train is, coming around, go back to State Street, right in there, right in like one of those corners, right there in the heart of it, that street that's rushing down through the loop, you get another building behind, which is the Carson Perry Scott store. Now, you see, that's designed a totally different way. That's not designed as part of a frontal panel to make you feel it coming down like a screen, or another frontal panel to make you feel the compression and tension. This celebrates the street, the dynamism of that new street, the dynamism of that big commercial street, which now, in 1899, where he does it up to here, then 1904, when he adds that much, is beginning to fill up with automobiles. rather than with carriages. So you begin to get a real sense of speed and power and danger and excitement on the street. Now, everything about it he handles just the opposite of the way he handled the tall towers. He doesn't disguise this at all. Instead, he exaggerates the Chicago window. And the proportion is set by Halliburton and Roach, but he makes you feel that it is very horizontal. And to make you feel the horizontality, he continues this band of ornament. So you have to read it this way. And then down below, here, with this iron metalwork across this, over that string course, that doesn't look supporting at all. That doesn't seem to have any steps of structure that would hold it. It's just a negative plane. You see it there. It's all right on the surface. And the glass is right on the same surface. It's absolutely thin, like this. So you feel those come, and they come to the corner. It's really wonderful. I think it's Madison Street. And then it's like somebody shifting gears. It opens up. And then it just balloons. I'll show you a detail of this later. It balloons out in glass and a web, a thicket coming out the corner, which is your place of entrance, which is really marvelous. Philip Johnson wrote a very dumb article back in the middle 50s or early 60s about how Sullivan's ornament was a holdover. Same thing Gideon said. It wasn't a holdover. As you see, it's essential to him. It's what he's working with. He's making us feel the whole building with the ornament. And because he's doing it with the ornament, you see, the building still fits where it is. He's decorating construction, not building decoration, like most of the over-designed buildings of the present day. And that's an old 19th century adage. Always decorate construction, never construct decorations. It's really a great thing, and that's what he's doing. Now, at the same time, he's completely remade the type. It's really great, but you can see how it's been incremental all the way. He's been respecting the problem, the approach, the street, the whole problem, the whole way. There's that dark, solid, heavy block of Richardson's, and now this is all light-colored and dynamism. And of course, I thought about it too. See, these are all carriages back there in 1884. By this time, by 1904, they're mostly automobiles. It's a different world. Now, on the other hand, there are other worlds too. That's the only one. Not the only one. There's the loop, and there's that long stretch back here. You come down the river to South Chicago, down the lakefront to South Chicago, and in 1893, you get another world. And it's a great vision. It's a vision far beyond anything that Sullivan had in terms of to change an urbanistic situation, to make a new kind of city. And that's, of course, the World's Columbian Exposition of 1893. And Daniel Burnham, the great Chicago architect, his partner, John Welborn Root, dies the year the fair opens, 93. Burnham is alone, does more and more planning as time goes on. McKim, Mead, and White come from New York. Richard Morris Hunt, the Dean of American Architects, is given the administration building design where we're sitting here. They all lay it out together, and especially Frederick Law Olmsted, the older one still at this time, lays it out. And it really is, in a way, like the plan of Vaux, in the sense that you're meant to come in there, ideally. Most people did come this way, but you're supposed to come down in boats, and a lot of people did. And they debark, and they come in this entrance and look down this way. And you see you have a long axis, then you have the transept going across, but now it's water down the middle, the parterre on the side. And indeed, then the buildings, it seems to me, they're like the forest, say, in Versailles. They're like the park. Those are the solids with all the wonderful things hidden inside them. Machinery Hall, this enormous building over here, one of the biggest buildings ever built at that time, and all the others with their wonders inside. But the center here is really much the same, and there's this cross-axis, and sculpture is an integral part of it. Here's the great Fountain of Columbia by McMoney sailing out this way. And then out at the end where you enter, you see they're feeling their oats. Now again, this has been held against classical architecture. This is, after all, opening the imperialist period in American history from, in a way, I suppose, we're still suffering. And that people were beginning to argue a few years later about whether we should stay in the Philippines, whether we shouldn't get out, whether we should be killing all those poor people who were voting against us after we'd helped them throw out the Spanish. All those things. History just repeats itself over and over again. And so this architecture celebrates that feeling. There they are, they've conquered the Indians. It's like Rome, you have a triumphal arch, you have heroic figures, you have the conqueror up there, and you have the barbarians that you conquered standing around. But it's classical architecture can do that, and it can do other things, as you know. It's flexible. It's not responsible. It's not guilty of some of the wonderful things or terrible things, at least very powerful things that it's expressing at the time. And this is really a great colonnade. You come in here, and then directly in front of you, there's a figure of Liberty standing up there, and really holding up a victor's crown. It's really liberty and victory. And she sort of sets your eye down, toward the administration building. So that's really, in a sense, the view you get as you come in. Now, imagine people coming into this. I mean, I have to keep telling myself this over and over again because I was so prejudiced against it when I was young. God help us all. I mean, really, we're in the hands of brainwashers, totalitarian brainwashers. It's really amazing. But imagine you come in from Chillicothe or someplace, or even from Chicago. You come in from the Loop. You come in from that dense, dark, dirty, hot, active, vital Loop. Wow, I mean, this is fantastic. It's just nothing like it. It's all white. Everything gets along with everything else. It all makes sense. There's air and space and light. There are gondolas on the thing. There are all kinds of boats. You get the great parterres, the flags. You get electric light. You get it all lighted up at night. It's magical. And it's the vision, of course, it's the vision that sparked the City Beautiful movement that I've talked about already. Now, you can imagine, too, you get that cross-axis where it's narrower. You see that the buildings are a very simple type. They're basically these exhibition buildings, one with a central pavilion, then a long horizontal colonnade of something of the sort going on both sides, and then a pavilion at the end. And as I'll talk about later in another lecture, though, that's really the basic French type coming from Perrault's designed for the Louvre in the middle of the 17th century. The pavilion, the long horizontal, the two pavilions at the end. Now, Louis Sullivan, later, and he was writing about this much later, said, of course, that this set American architecture back 50 years. I mean, he might have said it set my practice back 50 years, but it didn't set American architecture back. Also, how does one judge him or his motifs? Here he won't play. Now here you're designing a town, you're building a town, and he just won't do it. His administration building, he would not make classical. He said he wouldn't do it. He wouldn't paint it white, he painted red. By painting it red, is he trying to show socialist opposition to what he would have called the feudalism of imperialism? I don't think so. He didn't think in political terms, really. He just ornery, he won't do it. He and Sullivan say, he and Ryder saying we're correct, we're special. And it's also sectional. I mean, this is Chicago. He sees Burnham as a kind of traitor for being in these Easterners. So in other words, he paints his building red, makes it stand out. The modernists, of course, all hailed him for that 40, 50 years later. But should we really? I don't know. I don't know. The fact is that his building is a transportation building, and the way he increases the sides of the arcades and has a big arch here may give you a sense of dynamism like that he wanted to create, and which he felt would be lost in white. That's possible. On the other hand, his building isn't that original compared to the others. For example, if you look at the nave of Notre Dame of Paris here, when Viollet-le-Duc took it over to restore it in the middle of the 19th century, all the bays were like these. This is the way Chartres finally turned out to be. But he decided that originally, before the flying buttresses were added, that there was a 4-story elevation like this. And it's a very weird one, with the grand arcades and the tribunes. And then this is a rose window where no rose window was ever meant to be. It's under the roofs here of the clerestory, so there's no light from it, and then tiny clerestory windows. That's exactly Sullivan's elevation inside. You see the great space here, tribune space, the rows right here, and then the small clerestory windows up above. So it's clear that he too has his models, which is nothing against him, nothing against either one. Then, of course, you get, I'm sure Frank Lloyd Wright designed this great sunburst in the last of the Celtic, you might say. Though Sullivan, of course, was to use it later elsewhere. But the last that Wright does is bursting out here from the center. That's been criticized, too, as not being very integrated with the rest of the building, but I'm not so sure about that. I think it picks up that motif that we talked about. It makes you feel that energy, which kind of makes it, sets it apart in some sense from the other buildings. But what Sullivan didn't have, and Wright didn't have either, is what Burnham had. That is, they didn't have the plan. Burnham had the plan. And that plan became this great City Beautiful plan. And this is a City Beautiful plan that he proposed for Chicago in 1906. Now, I'll come back to it in a minute because I want to talk about its backgrounds. But just you can take a look at it and you see what it does for Chicago. Originally, the railroad is here and the lake is there. So there's no green space. There's no park. There's no green. It's all been squeezed out by real estate. So he gives it a great park there, a French parterre right there. He gives it back the lake. It's a great thing. It's a wonderful thing. It's right there. Then where we saw already where the loop stops there and then there's nothing, he puts the great center out there. And then there he surrounds the grid of the loop with the diagonal boulevards out into space of the City Beautiful movement. And you can see it. It's a wonderful conception. Very simple, and it's wonderful. It's great. Now, I'll come back to that. And of course, we know where he gets that. It comes from Versailles, fundamentally, as we've already seen. It comes from Lenote. And then from Washington. And it's about Washington I'd like to talk for a minute. City Beautiful Washington. Now, remember, Washington is designed by L'Enfant, basically for his commander-in-chief, George Washington. He'd been an officer in the Army during the war. And Jefferson, you remember, had proposed right here a tiny little grid town on what he called the Tiber, which is called Goose Creek, right there, looking down toward the grid of Alexandria down here. But L'Enfant's perception is fantastic. It's like Versailles. It's regional compared in scale compared to this. And we're showing here only the center of it over here. Now, here's a great plan. What does a plan like this take? Well, it takes generations. It takes a century or more to fill up, to grow. So it's a long-range business, as you all know. And it's very clear what he's doing. Here's the Capitol, which is on the height. There's no doubt that it's considered Congress rules, supposedly. Congress is on the height. Then the president is over here in the White House, lower down. He's an integral part of the system, but the height is there where the Capitol is. And they're connected by Pennsylvania Avenue, which runs out to where the entrance to the White House is conceived to be. Then the famous Ellipse Park is like this. And some kind of monument, eventually the Washington Monument, was supposed to be right there in axis, because we'll see later, when these monuments were built, because they didn't like the situation of the soil under the ground, that they moved a little this way, so that axis never has developed. It's a little bit off it like this. Then the other thing is Pennsylvania Avenue and the Mall. And that's the heart of the whole conception. Now that grows up, as you know, very, very slowly. With Thornton doing the White House and Bullfinch, Latrobe, so on, doing the Capitol. And say about the 1850, it looks more or less like this. And even there, he's exaggerated the size of the dome, looking toward the Capitol from the White House, because the dome was really pretty much like this, fairly low dome. And there's Pennsylvania Avenue. Then what they kept doing throughout the whole century up to the 1860s, as you know, was to expand the building laterally with the big office buildings of the Senate and of the Congress. And the Mall kept getting encroached upon, and they had various, and here's still Goose Creek, you see, still very obvious, but they always proposed the Washington Monument down there. And they often drew it like this, but this is by Robert Mills, but it was never finished. It never really looked like this. It was intended to be like this truncated pyramid, sort of circular column down here at the bottom. It's supposed to be right at the axis of the city hall, of the Capitol, right up there, but it never really was like that. But this always, by the time they got like this, in the work of Thomas Hugh Walter, by 1859, the dome really seemed much too low, that great horizontal stretch. So they proposed a very tall dome on a very high drum, but they proposed the drum so high, and the whole dome was supposed to be so high that they couldn't build it. And it stayed like this, unbuilt, through the first terrible years of the Civil War. And while they were losing all those terrible battles like Chancellorsville and so on, it looked as if Washington might really go, the country might go, this was always an example of the country being incapable of finishing its capital. It was standing out there. But finally, Walter worked out a way to do it in cast iron, or it could be much lighter. So this is his beautiful drawing of it, where he makes these great cast iron open-work trusses like this. Therefore, you're able to have this great dome. You see what they're doing? They're pushing classicism beyond anything it was ever intended to be, to fill the symbolic needs of the place and the bigger scale of the new place. And is that wrong? Is that expressing the structure? It's doing something much more important. It's trying to express an idea. It's trying to create the place. And as soon as they get it up there, they said, this is about the time of the Battle of Gettysburg. Just about this time, in 1863, they managed to complete it, and the figure they put on top was the figure of freedom there. So now you had, then, miraculously, in the 1880s, when they had a competition to replace Mills's design, which had never been built anyway, miraculously, this wonderful, clear image, this great obelisk pointing to the sun, was chosen, which is very odd at that time, when the design tended to be very fussy and highly elaborate, and all the other entries were deeply complicated. All of a sudden, this pure image, beautifully setting off and complementing the dome of the Capitol, appeared. And this was the structure. And you see where the Potomac came, right here. This is just as far out toward the edge as it could get, the point, but it's not on axis, you see? The axis of the White House, and there's the ellipse, comes across like that. So then, that's the way it stood in 1900, when the American Institute of Architects had its annual meeting there, and full of excitement for the whole thing, they organized the Macmillan Commission, full of excitement over Chicago, really, which is what had done it, and they proposed this. They proposed to really clean up the mall, have a very strong axis, have as strong a axis crossing here, even though it missed the monument, from the White House to a monument to Jefferson over here, then have a long reflecting pool coming out to a monument to Lincoln here, and then a bridge going across here to Arlington, beyond which, remember, is the Lee Mansion, the great antagonist right over there, right across the river, looking back on it, this great Doric mansion, which was Robert E. Lee's home. Well, they couldn't work it out quite that way, largely because this axis is impossible. There is no axis thing on the top that makes much sense, but nevertheless, it worked out finally this way. They did fill out all that part, as you can see it, of the Potomac, and they had the reflecting pool and the the Lincoln Memorial and the bridge to Arlington over there, and the big dome of the Capitol now dominates the whole thing, and the radiating avenues of L'Enfance go out there and then are added on to and so on, out through here, and the White House is here, and eventually, under Roosevelt, the Jefferson Memorial is built over here, more or less, right on axis with Roosevelt's bedroom. Yeah, everyone has said it's put there so Roosevelt could, and it's really true. From the White House, you can look right there, and he stands out under that dome perfectly clearly. But the great axis, of course, has always been this. Jefferson has always been just a little out of it, because curiously, the iconography of Washington is very martial. It's very military. And it very much has to do with the Civil War. The Civil War marked it, just the way the Civil War marked this country, even to the present day. And all this period when they were working this out, around 1900 and the generation after that, it's always the Civil War. The great figure right here under the Capitol who starts to look down that axis right there, is the figure of Grant. Grant defending the Capitol, looking toward Virginia this way, right down here. And he's looking toward the Washington Monument, then his commander-in-chief down there, and then Lee across the river right over there. And I think it's a wonderful monument. He's on a plinth, and infantry is coming up under him, marching on the plinth. Cavalry is coming from one side and artillery from the other. And you know, Grant was a great horseman. I mean, though he never dressed up like Jeb Stuart and so on, wearing his old private's blouse and so on, he may well have been the best horseman in the army. But he sits there like this, like grim death, with his hat pulled down, staring down like this. The horse is awake. He's like that. It's really grand. And he's looking down that. It energizes the whole thing. He's here, you see. You don't have to be so big to dominate a place. And he looks down toward this. And here you can just barely see the memorial down there. But as you know, when you get the other side of the monument, it slopes down, and you see the reflecting pool. And then the Lincoln Memorial at the end. And you get this question of whether what they did here for the World War II Memorial was a good idea or a bad idea. I think on the whole it was a very bad idea indeed to put it there. They do, it's true, try to leave this visual axis open, but you can't walk down here anymore. You have to go around. Also, for some reason, they make it higher here. There's a wall, maybe up 6-7 feet, so you don't get this French continuity of going right through, which is so important, you see, again, because you're on the flat, and what you're really aiming toward at the end, that water should be right. It shouldn't be above you when you're at that point. It is, too, and it's wrong. Where, again, the angle of reflection is the same as the angle of sight, and from way down here, you get it reflected here in the water. Now, this monument by Henry Bacon, which is finally built in 1922, is really a kind of miracle because they've been arguing about this ever since Lincoln's death. One proposal was to have, which I think I mentioned already, a long highway going out to Gettysburg, lined with monuments, and so on. A fascinating idea. Then all the other proposals were much more complicated than this. Finally, they chose this by Bacon. And it's so elegantly designed. It's on this hard limestone, this American limestone, almost like Greek marble. And all the states, southern states as well, are here. And the details are sharp and taut. And the proportions are pretty much like a Hellenistic temple, a late temple, which has gotten chunky, almost square in proportion. And his brother was an archaeologist at the site of Assos, which is a very beautiful Hellenistic site in Asia Minor, very near Troy. And he did some drawings for him. You can feel that. He's close to Greek here. It is wonderfully hard, tight. But it's a Greek temple turned sideways. You're looking at the side, and he has a set of columns. You can just barely see that figure. That's when the feast days are open and the figure of Athena just barely seen in the shadows of the temple. Remember I said Thomas Mann talking about two old women dismembering a child. What you have is mystery in there. What you have is Zeus. What you have is Lincoln in the shadows like this. It's almost square, and you're looking at the wide side, and it has a very clear model. It's by Ledoux. It's a building of a bank by Ledoux, a proposal for a bank. And you can see it has more columns and so on, but nevertheless, no, it has the same number here, but more on the side. That has 8 on the side, 12 on the side. And the proportions are not quite as nice. He builds it up a little bit. But you can see it's only a slight shift in proportion here that gives it this wonderful body. The Ledoux is kind of squashed down. Nevertheless, it must be the model. Now, as I say, everybody in my generation was brought up to despise this architecture. It's really hard to imagine. It's really true. I say, oh, what a shame. It had to be cut. It doesn't express us. It doesn't express our time. Our time. All of a sudden, we began to realize what our time was and what classical architecture was. It was for me, when this architecture first reduced me to tears, was in John Kennedy's funeral. It came around like this, and it went around like this. Then when it got about here, you suddenly realize what was there. Then inside was the other modern president, sitting in the shadows in this great figure by Daniel Chester French, looking out the way we've come, and suddenly you understood it all. I mean, classical architecture has the dimension of history. Classical architecture had seen all this. It had seen the Gracchi murdered, which is what happened here. Massacre, like this. Seen it all. And he looks out, remember, and then right in the middle, while we have all this, then Martin Luther King is killed, and Bobby Kennedy is killed, and the Reverend Abernathy, who takes over the poor people's movement from King, the poor tattered people out here in the rain, in the encampment, when Bobby Kennedy's funeral comes by and stops for a moment here in the rain, they reach out their hands and it goes by. You know what you're looking at. You're looking at the Gracchi murdered, after which more reactionary forces progressively take command of Rome. But see, it's really wonderful. He's looking at our garden, what it's all about, the whole thing, like that. And he's just there, like this, when the sun happens to hit him. And Maya's lens thing is so wonderful, see, because it calls to both, but it stays out of the way. Not like that one, that encyclopedia of a memorial that's there now that cramps the center. And finally, he looks all the way back, his general on horseback under that stretched dome. Now that's exactly what Burnham wanted to bring to Chicago. He wanted to bring, out beyond that tight grid, he wanted to bring this other vision, this vision of the government, the federal government, America, more than just the Middle West, more than just the tight buildings down in there. So he has this grand, he stretches, again, it's like St. Isaac's in Leningrad and St. Petersburg, much too high for proper classical architecture, but able to stretch itself to the demands of the age. And the plan, as I say before, is just right. There's the lakefront, there's the closed grid, there's the big space. And those boulevards, of course, some of them were already in construction in Burnham's time. All of them are still in use. It's a wonderful way to get around Chicago up there, and they're still very nice. His drawings are beautiful. His ideal boulevard, as he shows it here. But the whole thing was to get out there and have a center, make a statement, and open your arms around it. And that shows you, for example, they lost it. We lost all that. They didn't build it, of course. Later, in the 30s or whenever it was, or maybe the 50s, they wanted to have a civic center. Look what they did. They retreated from out here where you had to be, and they came right to the river, which is wrong, and into the loop, and they did what? What does that do? What's it saying? Nothing. Nothing. Like this. His real vision was right. See, there it is. It's ghostly. It's a great drawing. It's ghostly. It stretches out the fields of the Republic that stretch out endlessly, like that. And then the wonderful garden, and this, the river, and the thing. And it's great, as I said before. You can see it's exactly what Chicago needed. And it's too bad that it didn't get it. Out there in the space, though, thank heaven it did get the lakefront. Now, of course, what you did get with the lakefront is Michigan Boulevard comes into its own. It really becomes one of the great streets in the world because it's got a front on that great lake, the great garden, and these wonderful things like this. And you see that's the beginning of the Hollywood and Roach skyscrapers with Sullivan's building, part of the whole thing. See, they've added some stories to Sullivan's buildings, but not to the other. See, they love Sullivan's building. Okay? And there you are. And then where Sullivan's Auditorium building is, like this, that's where Congress Street was going to be widened from the Civic Center. And then coming right down here to the center, as was proposed at this point. So this building is right there. And they did widen the street, as I'll show you later. As a matter of fact, the sidewalk is now in the building, or what used to be in the building. That used to be the bar in there. Now it's the sidewalk. So the building comes down to where the cars are, like that. And you see, you would have seen it down there. You would have seen the great dome in the distance beyond the whole thing. Now, the auditorium, which I mentioned before, of 1888, 89, is really a marvelous building. When I saw it, right after the war, it was a ruin. It had just been taken over by a community college called Roosevelt University. They didn't have any money to fix it up. You come in that wonderful lobby you see down there where you have the arches. It just engulfs you. Go up there. And then most of all, you see that great tower. That great tower is over an enormous void. Imagine while they were building this down in those foundations, those muddy foundations, and they're playing like this, and they have to, as they build it up, they got to know that part of it is going to be heavier. And it's going to be heavier over where this great theater and opera house is built, right like this. Now, this doesn't look like much to say that the stage, and I stood on that stage and looked up. At that time, there was a ruin, and I could hear what Frank Lloyd Wright called another connection, the drip, drip, drip of dirty water coming down through it. Now it's all restored. And the great thing about this is the first great democratic theater. And I say democratic in this sense. The previous programs for theaters, especially opera houses, had all demanded to get as many boxes as close to the stage as you could. That was the whole trick. There they say, no, 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 we want the people. Great masses back here. And they have screens that can be let down, or used to close it off. But you can get way back there. In order to do that, the acoustics have to be perfect. And that's where Adler was great. And I sat back there, and people speak down there. It's perfect. It's like a Greek theater. It's perfect. It's really there. It's a great thing in there, that this thing itself. It isn't just a big theater. It's the first of an important theater. And then, of course, right above it rises the architects. Because here's the tower. And in the tower, he really gets thinner and tauter. He had a lift like this. And here's his office up here. That's where Frank Lloyd Wright and all those other people used to fight and hit each other with T-squares and all the things that Wright describes, perhaps mendaciously, about it. The architects are the kings of Chicago. In the way they still are to the present day. You get any taxi driver, anybody, he'll talk about architecture. That's right. And there they are. Then down below, it's really kind of wonderful where the street is. It's where the bar was. So there used to be glass and so on in these, but now there isn't any. It doesn't have to be. So you get this wonderful rustication, very primitive, down there below. Now, after 1988, this is 1888, after 1988, you just had to come a few blocks this way and cross Congress Street, cross State Street, which is where Carson Pirie Scott was. This is Congress, and you'd come to, oh yes, here you see the whole thing. Sorry, I should have shown it before. Now, all you have to do is come down, that one from there, this way, and all of a sudden you see them again. And this is the Harold Washington Library, Public Library. Harold Washington Public Library, of which Tom Beebe won the commission in 1988. And I happened to be on the jury. And it was a death struggle to get it accepted. But you see what he's doing? He's trying to be contextual. That was the great period for that, of the 80s. And he's trying to pick up the Sullivan motif. It's down there at the end. Then also, he basically, in the basic body of the library, which goes up above, he picks up the tower. That's the way those pilasters, the thin things like this, come out here. Now, it is interesting because this is this public space down below. Then you have 5 floors, which are all open, 4, sorry, which are all open through, except in here in this space, which is actually hollow. It's not real thickness of the wall. You have these little studies, which are secret. We had to fight for that because the worst clients in the world, I may have said that before, around that time especially, were librarians. They all insisted that you had to have it one open space that one person could oversee. And they didn't want any place where people could sneak away and do bad things. So they were always afraid of what people might do if they got in there. God, I hope they did, but in any event. But we had to fight for that, and we finally got it. And so you got that rather wonderful lift of this thing up to biggest public spaces are up above. Now that's not so nice because that's that way so the homeless won't find their way there. That's really why it's that way. And Ligaretta from Mexico, the only Latin in it, had big open arcades at the side of his building for the poor. It's like going back to the Medici Riccardi before it was closed in at the corner and it opened up. But his was a bad design. It was all mixed up with somebody else. It didn't work. But nevertheless, it's very contextual. You see, it really picks up that. And finally, there it is. Now, there's a lot behind it besides Chicago, of course. In terms of the arcuation over the lower floor, it goes back to the first modern library, the Bibliotheque Centenaire that we talked about. It also alludes to one that I haven't talked about Here, the McKinley and White's Public Library in Boston of 1888. You see what they do. It's kind of interesting. They take the Labrousse design, which is very tight and closed and has only one entry there in the middle, and they open it out. And they make it more Roman. They give it depth in the arcades up here. It feels more Roman. Give you 3 openings like this. It's much more generous, much freer, much more open than the tight French one. Tom has some of that, but all of that here is adjusted to the loop. Because where he is on Congress Street, right here, is really the south facade of what the Chicago people feel is the real loop, which is the part that goes north from here. Because the train is right in there. It's right behind the building. You see in the moment. It's coming in between those buildings here, like that. And it's really on the south facade of the loop, so it picks up the scale of Richardson, the scale that Richardson had set, and which this Chicago school building has right there. Then it's sort of the facade of the loop. Right behind it is the train. And it comes right up here, perfectly scaled to its basement as it comes through there. And there's a stop there. Then on the other side, you can see it's close to an alley, which is much narrower than the bigger street, which is over here. And on that side, Beebe took advantage of the fact that it was just tight in that alley to have that facade be all glass, which means all his services are here in his offices. He can change them as they like, and they always have light. But they don't impede on the gallery, on the library spaces, well, which are on the other side. But then he wanted more than that, because this is, after all, Burnham Street. And this would have been the heart of Burnham's. And so he wanted a great classical image. So he got a man named Kent Bloomer, who teaches at Yale, to design this ornament, which is some sort of metal alloy. And it's enormous in scale. Now this represents something very important you should think about. For a lot of public buildings, as you know, the government forces you to use, I think it's 1% of it, for art. So what they usually do is they get done in buildings and they, we take this one, we'll get Joe's so-and-so to do a thing, a piece of sculpture, we'll put it somewhere. Tom wanted to use it in a more integral way, like the Greeks. He wanted to be an integral part of the building. So he's able to get that worked through. So here's this great big, very Greek, but big scaled thing that should be there. It's not there in the photographs you see. You see it here, the scale of it. The life is like fire. Really pretty wonderful, I think. And very big. And you get at the corners this great acroteria, like this. So that it really is saluting the street like this. And you see it here, complete, with which is part of it. Now you also see that it really sums up everything. I mean, talk about Tom really summing up, and Beebe knows Chicago probably better than any other architect in the world. All of Chicago we've talked about. There's the Loop with its chunky buildings. There's Burnham's Plan, or its ghost, going down to the lake into one of Sullivan's great buildings. Most of all, there's that quality which really is the Loop, which is the buildings, those skyscrapers, are not very high. They're chunky, rectangular blocks. And where the big buildings appear, you see them over there, the newer buildings in Chicago, they're of a different type. They're of a type who grew up in an entirely different place, and that is in New York. Now, I'll talk about that next time, but I want to say one word. You can see how different the places are, and you might think about them. Here is this island sailing toward Europe. And it's almost the first thing you see as you come in. You're an immigrant, especially in the 19th century. That's what you see. And they want here spires to be seen. They want to be seen from the sea. In Chicago, with this grid in the Loop at the side of Lake Michigan, they never really thought about being seen at all. They thought, as we've always seen, about rentable space, bay width, maximum size, but size, and traditional urbanism, basically, as we've seen, grows up there. And Beebe sums all that up. But in New York, and also you had these block buildings. There's the Marshall Field Warehouse there, for example, in Chicago, because they're on a grid. The grid dominates the grid becomes Chicago, as we've seen. But you see, that's not what New York has. New York's grid is only way back beyond, north of the place where the skyscrapers are built. It's a very different kind of grid, and it's not laid out until 1811, like this. What you have down there is the old Dutch town, and that town is irregular in shape, and Broadway runs diagonally through it, and the Battery is down here, and Wall Street is a wall right there. So the skyscrapers, they come to be built here, like those here, tend to take an irregular pattern. And as things are in that relationship, they tend to grow up in one great pyramidal pattern there at the end of the island. And we'll talk about that next time. Thanks.